Hello, thank you for coming to this talk. So we're going to go over all the work that's been going on over time, and we're going to talk about where we're at. So, thank you. I figured I was loud enough. So, even though it's IP support, I like to call it large NID support. This is a project, and that reason is because it's one of these projects that expands even more than IP version 6. It can support lots of new interface technologies that come out. It can support IB hardware addressing. For example, the native, we don't have to set up IP addresses anymore on the infinite bands anymore like we could. That's now a possibility. So this has been a long-term project, as they pointed out earlier. It's 2012 people were talking about supporting this. Some places were demanding this as a feature site requirement, and it just never happened. And it was such a long time that actually it didn't seem like there was any interest in this project. And when we started really landing it and starting to put in the key features to make this work, all of a sudden we start seeing people asking on the ticket, is this feature ready for us to test? Can we deploy this at our site? And I was quite shocked that it's at this state, actually, that it has this kind of interest. In fact, for the people in the audience, how many people are interested in IP version 6 support at their sites for deployment? So yes, there's some here, actually, that this is a requirement. So this is actually a collaboration project between SUSE and ORNL. We started to do this. We started all the way back in to complete it by 2016. There's actually someone who's been testing it, Yuda Yekshak. He's from Amazon, and they have their own LND they're working on, and it's actually a large NID support. So he's been actually our other tester. And he's been doing a really great job pointing out any bugs that we're not seeing. And the goal of this is to complete the foundational work for the 2.16 release. We want people to be able to set up an LNet configuration, bring it up, and mount it using IP version 6 with its basic functionality support. There are some things that will not be completed by 2.16. 2.17 will complete for things like node map and GSS. These are the things that aren't hard requirements to set up your system, but they're features that people like to use. All right. So what has the progress been up to the 2.15 release? So the ticket was open in 2016, and the reason this all came about was because, believe it or not, is the native Linux client support. So at that time, a couple of years ago, we were talking about pushing the native Linux client upstream, and Dave Miller, who's the network manager for the Linux kernel, said, you need IP version 6. That's a hard requirement now for everything. And that makes sense, because there's this whole idea that we're running out of IP version 4 space. And because of that, SUSE has been actively involved with it. They're more the lead on it. I've help out and do a lot of the work, but it's actually they are the driver of this. Neil Brown has been the driver. So, and then in late 2019, we had people got together and start discussing how to do the design and how we're going to handle these large NIDs. This is a huge protocol change. We're talking about wire protocols, everything being changed. And then the issue is what about the future? Right now, we don't want to be in the same boat before where the LNet NID was like just a 64-bit handle. We were like, what if it expands even further in the future? In fact, the socket layers, if you look at it, they're actually support up to 256 bits of handles for their data. So we were like, we need to have it be very extensible. Also, this is one of the largest projects. You wouldn't believe how much NIDs are used throughout the entire stack. It's in every subsystem almost. So this is one of the projects that touch like everything. So you get to dabble with everything. So if you actually people contribute or test it or that, you'll find that things that unusual that you'll be looking at that you didn't look at before. So by 2.15, we actually landed most of the core functionality inside of LNet that wasn't exposed to the users. So a lot of those changes were done. But at that time, we didn't actually have the transmission of large NIDs over the wire protocol. So all the internals were done, but we didn't have any communication. And the user land tools, of course, didn't support any of this. Though we do need to backport some things to 2.15 to allow the support, so that way if you do mount a file system, large NIDs come in to the change logs and things like that, it knows how to handle that and gracefully and not crash your system. So what was the main thing that changed it? And this is the design, the core design was the LNet NID. So it's a 64-bit handle. It's the net type ORD with the address. And so what we did is we actually expanded it. Neil came up with the idea that we would make this NID structure with the NID size in it and the types and the numbers. And this is very extensible. So you can actually expand the NID address. And because of the NID size, you don't have to fill up the entire structure. So this is super flexible. We decided that the NID type FF would be like any NID. And this change is like the core of the core of it. And at the same time, NID structure, if you look at it, it's the NID size, the first 2 bytes, the first 64 bits is actually equivalent to LNet NID _net. So it actually overlaps. So that way you can stuff that in the same structure and it flows quite well. So actually it's extremely flexible. But this little change touched everything in the entire stack. So what looks different to the user LAN and what you would see like if you wrote tools. So we had to do a lot of changes. This is good examples. So we had to convert back and forth between the 2 formats. Allow that. So there's 2 macros. These are all things that you can see. So if you're going to write utilities or things like that, we had to create a macro NID is the same to compare them, because before you could just compare the 64-bit with the 64-bit, but now it's much more complicated, of course. And of course, there's no guarantee that the 2 NIDs are actually the same size. So you have to take those kind of things in effect. There's something called the LNet process ID, and that's the PID and also the NID. So you can do, like Lustre has its own PID, DVS has its own PID. So we had to change that structure. The NID any became any NID. That's how we got around that. Lilo, which is the loopback device, we had to make a special macro for that. And all of this is being done for Wireshark. So anyone use Wireshark stuff here? Okay, so there are some. So yeah, these are all the kind of changes impacts that. So Wireshark depends on the header LNet IDL.h. And as you can see, this impacted like those are all wire protocol headers that we send. So all of those had to be changed, and we have all new ones, new protocols. So the wire packets will go over the wire. And you can actually observe this with Wireshark, though I think Wireshark will have to be updated to support this now. So there are actually quite a big changes visible with the tools now. So now you can use these really large strings with these tools like LNet. You can list your NIDs. We wrote the protocol, the tool, so that the old multi-rail tool will work as well as the modern tools with the large NIDs. Internally, so that's the big change. Internally, it is where the real magic, a lot of changes happen. So when we looked at it, there are roughly 50, 60 ioctals doing the managing of LNet. And because of this change, that would mean that we'd have to create a whole new set of ioctals. So when we did this, I said we'll end up what happens if LNet structure changes in the future and expands. So I designed a netlink YAML API. So since we use YAML automatically, it translates it into netlink packets. And this allows us to change the interface without breaking the API. In fact, I call it a stable API for unstable APIs, because the tools will always work if you change the APIs, say backwards and forwards. It's very, very difficult to break the tools. So we never have to worry about that. LNet has had a history of updating its tools and not being able to work with different kernel versions because the ioctls changed over time. The other thing I did was there was different ioctl sets for the pre-multi-rail and the new multi-rail. I merged those to use the same API. So we don't need to have two sets of ioctls anymore for those kind of behaviors. So this is a lot of work being done right now. There are several patches done. Quite a few of them are not merged at this point, but they are in the progress. In fact, I just refreshed them, and I've been working with Oleg resolving some of the issues with them. Things like LNet, cuddle, net, show, and set, and discovery. Those are being worked on. There's patches outstanding. Import, export, and the UDSP patches, and the net fault. So net fault is like you can simulate network errors and stuff. So that work needs to be filled in. Net fault isn't like a hard requirement. Import and export are. UDSP could probably be done in 2.17. Not every site uses that at this point, but that is the goal, is to get that to go. And then, so there are other tool changes that needs to be done. LNet self-test, that is also being moved to the same API. That one's a bit trickier to do. And one of the big changes, you will notice that currently it's a kind of parser shell interface. You'll be able to use LNet YAML configs to actually set up your test. There's a couple other things I would like to see with that. I like to see use LNet self-test on a live network instead of just setting up a phony network and testing it that way. Other changes that already have gone in is the NRS stuff. So if you work with NRS, we're accepting the large strings now, so you can do that if you use that. All the NID export hash stuff, if you examine that, that is also, it'll show all the large strings. And of course, the big changes are the mount command. You can do that with the IP version 6. I'm working on that patch right now and trying to resolve that. So you'll be able to see this. There's some other work that's being done, like Andreas asked that we could do multiple NIDs for the mount command. So there's all this extensionality that we're actually looking at doing as well. So what's left? So that's all this. What's the big stuff left? So the big thing is the MGS has a NID table. So the NID table is used for imperative recovery. We get a list of all the NIDs from the clients and things like that. So we need to actually enhance that. So right now, all those NIDs come down in a list to your the MGC on the client. Right now, it bars. If you do that, it just so we need to actually gracefully handle that. So I've submitted a patch that takes it and reads it, and then even if it gets large NIDs, it will sort through the NIDs, because not all large NIDs are large. Some are small, so it'll actually filter and still accept them. So with newer servers, it'll gracefully handle that. The other thing is UUIDs. So we all know what our devices have UIDs. Usually you see something like Lester, your name of your file system -MDT000, right? Well, MGC is different. If you ever looked at it, it's MGC, your NID string, and then _0. Well, that string inside, which is used on a lot of stuff, is only 40 characters big. Well, guess what? Our IP version 6 eats every space and it overflows, and then the guy from Amazon is like, the MGC is breaking really bad because of that. So we just discovered that, and we're kind of like, we have to figure out how to store it. So I talked to Andreas. He said we could just store the NID and that's it, and the rest we can kind of just cobble together. We'll have to do that. Change logs. Of course, we have our infamous change logs that everybody uses. That has to be done. There's actually a patch for that outstanding, but has not been merged or looked at. I haven't looked at it yet. Other things that are critical is the get identity. So I don't know if you're familiar what that is. So that's the system where it gets your user IDs and GIDs and makes Lustre aware of what it is. Well, currently the way we send it, we send NIDs with that information because it has to know like with what mount point is going on. So we need to change that. So there are some patches outstanding for that. I think a better approach to that would be to use like a UDEV rule, and we can send stuff. So that way it's more flexible in the future and with strings and things like that. The other one is the secure protocol RPC stuff. So if you use GSS, we need to handle that. There's actually some patches to that, but I think there's some implementation stuff that needs to be done there that's better. Like GSC doesn't work easily out of the box like with InfiniBand. There's quite a bit. So those are kind of things that will be done in the 2.17 cycle with that, the secure GSS stuff. Node map, that's a big one. That's a lot. That's going to be a good sized task. That's going to also be 2.17. Does anyone use node map here? One person, two people. Okay. Yeah, so IP version 6, I don't think I will get that ready for that. Another big thing is we have to test interopt. So because of all these wire changes and stuff, this is a huge change. So we need to make sure that older clients work with this work and it doesn't break anything. So that is a really big deal. So if anybody, once we have this ready, we really need testers out in the field as well to make sure with the combinations. Because you think, oh, it's just a client and the server, but what happens if you have routers? That adds a detail that makes it even more complicated. And you can have routers with IP version 6 on one side and not on the other. What if you set up a multi-rail configuration where you take your Ethernet connection and you put IP version 6 and IP version 4 on it? These are all kinds of different scenarios. So you don't really think about it until you actually start looking, oh, users could do this, users could do that. It becomes really, really complicated. So it's really needed the testers. So that is something if the community wants to really push this forward, yes, please step forward and test. And just let me know how your testing is going. Report bugs. Now, that is to just give you basic support. Now there's some goodies coming. So one of the biggest goodies is LNet discovery in the background. So that's something that's been worked on. Most of it's done. The other one is IP specification. So because you can have network aliasing on the same Ethernet port, you can specify specifically the IP. Like when you do your LNet cuddle net add, usually you do it to the interface. You'll be able to do it with NIDs. So that's a nice handy feature that is being worked on. The imperative recovery logs for the client to server, we are working to make LNet discovery and IR logs to bring up the LNet. You'll never have to set it. If you configure your Lustre Lite with write-conf in that, you just mount your file system and it brings up LNet for you. You don't have to do any LNet configs. And that's probably one of the best things that will excite the admins here. No more LNet fuddling. Unless you want to like really fine tune it. Yes. So so this means also you can do stuff like add a new network to your file system without write-confing. These are like really big changes. Another proposal is to add hostname in the config logs. So you don't have to use IP addresses. It'll be do a DNA resolve. The other types of LND drivers, we have to figure out like a naming convention for those, like what you would call like your KFLND. I don't know what you would call those kind of interfaces, but we're going to add those kind of abilities to do that. So your mount string will have to be a number. It could actually be a name. And that's the conclusion. So we already have the core functionality complete for 2.16. We have, it'll all be done, the minimum to get it going. By 2.17, everything will be completed. There's some new features and things that will make people happy. And of course, once this is all completed, imported to the native client, we're going to give it another shove upstream. So we'll see Linus's and Dave Miller's reaction to this work and everything we've been doing. And lastly, I would love to give acknowledgments to the Department of Energy for all this work and the funding. Otherwise, I would be homeless and this wouldn't get done. And thank you for listening to this talk. Any questions?
Thank you, James. Any questions? How about our cloud vendors that we have today here? Since this will require extensive testing for different configurations, do you see a viable path that you might take off some load over there and help with the testing? First of all, is this useful to you? Let's start from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Daryl from Amazon. So absolutely useful. This is great. And it's great to see that you're working with other teams within Amazon, the Annapurna team, who's helping you with this. Definitely we want to get involved in the testing. So I think this is going to be very useful and exciting to see this coming relatively soon. So absolutely.
So one of the things I heard about cloud vendors is that you will actually do dynamic IP addressing over time. Like your DHCP clients will change the NIDs underneath. And I heard this is a common setup in cloud environments.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I'd have to look at or talk to some of the engineers on the team to see exactly how we do that. With AWS, we have a different networking stack, as many of you may know. So it's not a typical, it's not typically what you would run on-prem. So we have to do a little sort of magic behind the scenes. So we always have to take that into account when we start working with sort of customizations to that stack. So
I'm not the guy who puts people under spotlight without any further notice, but Microsoft, what about you?
At least right now, I know, like if our NIC goes down and the VM goes down, it will come up with just the same IP.
Okay.
We're using V4. We've had questions about V6, but I don't know what the pressing need, like at least right now. Like we're still in public preview, so I think we'll know a lot more once we GA in like a month or two here. Regarding testing, James and a couple others were talking about integrating with Malu. We have an internal database of all of our tests and like how Allster has passed or failed or whatever across things. And these run at a bunch of different cadences. There's integration tests, but there's also like a ton of different tests. So I've started to put together a list for you around the tests we spin up with, some simulated, some with like real hardware. And I'll share that. I've gotten the okay from my boss to share it, so I'll either just post it on the discuss list or send it, whatever.
You might want to capture it permanently, not only discuss this, but discuss list is a good way to start.
Yeah, it's constantly in flux. We add stuff like all the time. Like we have a hit list of especially HSM tests that we're continuing to add. So I think.
Maybe talk to James and Andreas and others how they want to capture that information.
Okay.
Thank you. For some reason, I've been called the arm twister, but yeah. Any other questions?
I see some nice traps have been set for developers with symbol names with single character differences and just reversed components. I was just wondering whether it was considered just to add a suffix to symbol names or whether it's just a non-issue.
So you're talking about like the naming convention for the UUIDs, like why it's done that way? I'm trying to understand the question.
I guess I think there was a slide with comparisons of some symbol names and just that there needs to be a differentiator, and I think there was an underscore removed and just components moved around to differentiate them.
Oh, yes, yes. I see what you're saying. Yes, yes. That was all done to make it aware of those changes. Yes. We try to keep it similar, but we actually, in fact, the names make a little more sense. Like before it was LNet, any NID, NID any. It was NID any, and it was that where now it's like LNet any NID makes more sense. But yeah.
Any other questions?
Down front.
Thanks, James.
Wait,
Yeah.
we're trying to make it so we don't use those structures. We're trying to make it, when I write the APIs, I want people to use more the NID string, because the NID string will just work. You don't have to worry about formatting into different formats. I try to avoid using those binary representations, because those binary representations are not guaranteed to stay same. Just that's something to keep in mind.
You mentioned IB hardware addresses.
Yes, the
And
GUIDs.
So that's what would be the use for that? Would that allow us to avoid the IPO IB
Yes,
stack?
you wouldn't have to set up IP on it. No, it would address it that way. In fact, in the Mellanox stack, like you can actually scan its own proc space to find its own GID to set it up. It's actually kind of neat. You don't have to actually like go in and explicitly set it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
With the longer NIDs where they would be tied to hardware-based variables, say like a GID, for example, client side seems awesome. Server side seems like a huge headache. You swap out an IB HCA and all of a sudden you're modifying NIDs on pools.
Yes, and you're exactly right. And that's why the LNet discovery work, we're doing that. So when you do that, it's all automated and it'll propagate through the stack. But you're right, there's a lot of that.
Does that come with a bottle of booze?
That's
Take a
what,
couple drinks before you hit enter? Kind of.
that's a good point. And the thing is like, I know you're like using like SysFS entries and stuff like that, and those are going to be renamed. So there's going to be UDEV rules to let you know that those changes happened. So that leads into my self-healing file system work that I'm working on. But it's the same thing. It'll notify you, and you can write scripts that catches those events, and then you can update your scripts or whatever and restart them with to be notified that these NIDs happened, these changes.
So until the perfect file system exists, there's going to be some crossover period where this functionality exists, and people who work on server side of file systems are going to have to add that to their stack of things to pay attention to. Potential for hardware replacements, things like that, causing reconfigurations on pools or changing of NIDs, things like that, just extra.
Yes. Right now that functionality doesn't exist. That's a 217 item, but I hope that it should theoretically all be in there when 217 is complete. Now remember, 217, I don't think that's the next long-term release. 218 will probably most likely. Historically, it's been every 3 versions, 212, 215. So we should hopefully have sorted out all these things.
Okay.
I mean, unless you're brave and you like to run developer branches.
Don't test it, deploy it.
Andreas or Peter, I heard one or both of you. Let me hit Andreas first.
Yeah, I would concur with James that firstly, that functionality doesn't exist. But secondly, you can still always use IP over IB, right? So you don't have to use that. It's just a way, because people do complain sometimes in large clusters, like why do we have to set up IP over IP, and then they're not sure, you know, are we using IP for any of the communication, which they don't want, and things like that. And we only use it for the address, basically just to figure out what the host is, and then we grab the GUID and use that inside Mellanox or the LID or whatever the internal addressing is for verbs. And so to get rid of that, it's intended to be a simplification, right? And, you know, if you don't change the hardware, it would work, but, you know, it's going to happen sometimes. But dynamic discovery and using the MGS imperative recovery log, it should be that the servers will contact the MGS and then report all of their NIDs, and then the clients will contact the MGS and then get all of the NIDs, you know, and they'll only have to talk, you know, TestFS OST7, and then they'll just get the list of NIDs for that, and you don't have to put it anywhere in configuration logs. That's the whole goal.
No, also, if we have like the host name lookups, the NIDs can change under that, but the actual host name, if you remap that, then that still works seamlessly. You won't notice a change in that case as well.
Yeah, hi, James. I was just heckling you about the your comment about the next LTS. I'm up here. Well, eventually, but basically between, you know, it was 2.10 to 2.12 with just 2 versions.
Okay, you're right.
And then 2.12 to 2.15 was 3. So I think we deliberately, I mean, I would love one day to be as like predictable as Ubuntu and just say it's going to come out April every 2 years or something. But we're a little way off that. So I think we need to keep a bit of flexibility to look at what makes sense in terms of the situation about when the releases actually come out, which really just depends a lot on the amount of testing engagement, how ready the development is that's being contributed, etc. So yeah, it could be, you know, it might be the other way around, that we're determining the LTS around when we've got this stuff worked out rather than vice versa, right?
Okay.
So yeah.
Did you hear that? You need to test it to get the LTS out the window.
And our cloud vendors will help with that. Any other questions? Of course.
There's been instances with utilities that, and you mentioned a bunch that are going to need to be updated, where I've tried something and it's not supported and it like throws like some weird error. So like, if possible, if there's like something that's known to not work, if they could get a scrutable error out of it that says like this isn't supported, that would be like, instead of just something like bizarre. I've seen like some really weird IO errors and other things thrown. That I have to like dig through code to be like, oh, this just isn't supported yet with this tool. So it's like a friendly ask if it's easy.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So
like with NodeMap, you called out that being like kind of a long pole for support, and I can totally see myself like a year from now trying this out and being like, what is going on?
So I do try to make the tools flexible where they work across all versions. I'm kind of picky about that. I hate when tools don't work across all versions. So I do try to do that. But yes, you're right. There's some backporting that has to be done for some of these things, and we've had discussions about that. You know, like 2.15, we're going to have to land some things that makes it seamlessly flow without breaking things badly. That's part of the interrupt testing that I was asking for people to participate in to make sure that's the case.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, that was a lively discussion. Megan? Thank you, James.